On Christmas Eve, 1945, the Sodder family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, went up in flames, and 5 of the children vanished without a trace. But when the smoke cleared, firefighters made a chilling discovery. There were no bodies. Not a single bone or tooth was ever found in the ash, and so began a lifelong search for a heartbroken family, and one of America's most bizarre and haunting unsolved mysteries. Were the Sodder children consumed by the fire, or were they stolen into the night? At the heart of this mystery was the Sodder family. George Sodder was the American dream come to life. An immigrant from Sardinia, Italy, he came to the United States at just 13 years old and, through sheer hard work, built a successful trucking business. He and his wife, Jenny Cipriani, also an Italian immigrant, settled in the small coal mining town of Fayetteville, home to a large Italian community. The Sodders were a respected middle-class family with 10 children, and their large, 2-storey wooden home was always bustling with life. But George was a man of strong opinions, and he wasn't afraid to share them. He was a passionate vocal critic of the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, which often caused friction with others in Fayetteville's Italian community who supported the fascist regime. These arguments were public and sometimes heated, creating an undercurrent of tension in their otherwise happy lives. In the months before Christmas of 1945, a series of strange events began to unfold. That fall, a life insurance salesman got angry after George turned him down. He warned George that his anti-Mussolini talk would come back to haunt him, allegedly threatening that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed. Not long after, another man showed up at the house asking for work. He pointed to the fuse boxes at the back of the house and told George they'd cause a fire someday. This was strange to George. He'd just had the whole house rewired and inspected when they installed a new electric stove, and he knew it was perfectly safe. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, the older Sodder sons noticed a strange car parked on the highway, its occupants just watching the younger children as they walked home from school. At the time, these seemed like strange, unrelated incidents. In hindsight, they became the sinister prologue to an unimaginable tragedy. Christmas Eve of 1945 started with joy. Marion, the eldest daughter at home, brought presents for her younger siblings from the dime store where she worked. 12-year-old Martha, 8-year-old Jenny, and 5-year-old Betty were so excited they begged their mother to let them stay up late. Jenny agreed, just reminding them to feed the cows and close up the chicken coop before bed. 14-year-old Maurice and 9-year-old Louis were also allowed to stay up. Around 10 p.m, Jenny and George went to their downstairs bedroom with their youngest child, 2-year-old Sylvia. The house grew quiet. At about 12:30 a.m, the phone rang, startling Jenny awake. The woman on the other end asked for a name Jenny had never heard of. In the background, Jenny could hear laughter and clinking glasses, like from a party. She told the woman she had the wrong number and hung up, but the call left her feeling uneasy. On her way back to bed, she noticed the lights were still on and the front door was unlocked. In their excitement, the kids had forgotten their chores. Jenny shut the curtains, turned off the lights, and assumed the children were all sound asleep in their attic bedrooms. She had just drifted off when a loud bang on the roof followed by a rolling noise woke her up again. Thinking nothing of it, she fell back asleep. Just an hour later, around 1:30 a.m, she woke up for a third time, this time to the smell of smoke. George's office was on fire. The room was filling with thick black smoke, and flames were starting to crawl up the walls. Jenny screamed, waking George, who immediately yelled for their older sons, John and George Jr., who also slept downstairs. The parents and 4 of their children, Marion, John, George Jr., and baby Sylvia, scrambled out of the burning house, but 5 children were still missing. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty were trapped upstairs in the attic. Panic took over. The staircase was already a wall of fire, completely blocked. George, desperate to save his children, ran outside to grab the heavy ladder he always kept leaning against the house, but it was gone, vanished. Frantically, he tried to drive one of his coal trucks up to the side of the house to climb on top and reach the attic windows, but neither of his trucks, which had worked perfectly just the day before, would start. Helpless, the surviving Sodders could only stand in the snow and watch in horror as their home was swallowed by flames, collapsing into the basement in just 45 minutes. They assumed their 5 children were dead, but their nightmare was only just beginning. Every attempt the family made to get help was met with baffling failures. When Marion ran to a neighbour's to call the Fayetteville Fire Department, the operator didn't respond. A call from a tavern downtown also failed to get through. It was later discovered that the Sodders' phone line hadn't been burned, it had been cut. Inexplicably, the fire department, located just 2.5 miles away, didn't show up until morning, nearly 7 hours after the fire started. By then, the Sodder home was nothing more than a smoking pile of ash. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, claimed the delay was because he had to wait for someone who could actually drive the truck to become available. After a brief 2-hour look through the rubble, Chief Morris told the grieving parents they'd found nothing, no bones, no organs, no human remains of any kind. He suggested the fire must have been so hot that it had completely cremated the children's bodies. Just days later, 5 death certificates were issued, citing fire or suffocation as the cause of death. The fire itself was officially blamed on faulty wiring. But for Jenny Sodder, that explanation was impossible to accept. She started doing her own simple, heartbreaking experiments, burning animal bones in the yard to see if they'd be completely destroyed. They never were. She even spoke to an employee at a local crematorium who confirmed her fears. Bones don't just disappear, even in 2,000-degree heat for over 2 hours, far hotter and longer than the 45-minute house fire. The family's doubt grew into a conviction. The official story made no sense. How could a fire that left behind parts of appliances and a tin roof completely destroy every trace of 5 children? And what about all the other bizarre details? The missing ladder, later found thrown down an embankment, the trucks that wouldn't start, the cut phone line, the strange visitors in the months before. George and Jenny became convinced the fire wasn't an accident, but a deliberate act of arson meant to cover up a kidnapping. They believed their children weren't dead, they had been stolen. Fueled by a desperate hope, the Sodders refused to let the case close. George bulldozed the site of his former home, not to erase the memory, but to turn it into a memorial garden for his children. In 1952, they put up a large billboard on Route 16 with the smiling faces of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny and Betty. It offered a $5,000 reward for information, which they soon doubled to $10,000. This billboard became a haunting local landmark for over 30 years, a constant public symbol of a family's refusal to give up. George and Jenny poured their life savings into the search, hiring private detectives and chasing down every lead. Tips and sightings flooded in from all over the country. A woman at a tourist stop 50 miles away claimed she served the children breakfast on Christmas morning with a man and woman in a car with Florida license plates. A hotel worker in Charleston, West Virginia, saw their pictures and said she'd seen 4 of the 5 children about a week after the fire, accompanied by 2 men and 2 women who seemed to be of Italian descent. George drove across the country to investigate every claim. He heard Martha was in a convent in St. Louis and went there. He heard a story about a conversation in a Texas bar about a Christmas Eve fire in West Virginia and looked into that too. Each lead ended in a dead end, but his hope never died. Back home, the family uncovered even more problems with the official story. They were told the fire was electrical, but the Christmas lights on their tree had stayed on in the early stages of the blaze. If faulty wiring was the cause, the power should have been out. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery came from the fire chief himself. Years later, after hearing rumours, Chief Morris admitted to George that he had found a box containing what he said was a beef liver and buried it in the rubble. He hoped the family would find it, believe it was human remains, and give up their search. This cruel and bizarre deception only strengthened the Sodders' determination. In 1949, George funded his own excavation of the site, bringing in a pathologist from Washington, D.C. The dig turned up a few small objects and, most importantly, several pieces of human vertebrae. Hope surged through the family, but it was quickly crushed. They sent the bones to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. The report was a bombshell. The vertebrae belonged to a single person, aged between 16 and 23. The oldest missing Sodder child, Maurice, was only 14. The report also stated the bones showed no signs of ever being in a fire. They were likely in the filled dirt George had used for the memorial garden. Instead of answers, the family was left with even more questions. Years bled into decades. George Sodder passed away in 1969, never knowing what happened to his children. Jenny, who wore black in mourning for the rest of her life, continued to tend the memorial garden. And then, in 1968, more than 20 years after the fire, a piece of evidence arrived that was so specific, it reignited the entire mystery. Jenny received an envelope in the mail, postmarked from Kentucky, with no return address. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his mid to late 20s. He had dark, curly hair and dark eyes. The family was shocked by his uncanny resemblance to their son Louis, who would have been about that age. On the back was a cryptic handwritten note: Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Illil boys, a 90132 or a 90135. The family hired another private detective to investigate this new lead, sending him to Kentucky, but the detective was never heard from again. Fearing that making the photo public could put their son in danger, the Sodders kept some details private, adding the new photo to their billboard, but holding back the information from the postmark. The identity of the man in the photo and the meaning of that strange code remains a mystery. The theories about what happened that night are numerous and dark. The most prominent one, held by the family, points to the Sicilian mafia. They believe George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini made him a target and that the children were kidnapped in retaliation. This theory was supported by the sightings of Italian-looking people with the children and the threats George had received. Jenny Sodder passed away in 1989 and the family finally took down the weathered billboard that had stood for so long. The remaining children and their children continued to search for answers. Sylvia, the baby carried from the fire, was the last of the Sodder children who was in the house that night. She passed away in 2021, carrying the weight of her family's grief and her promise to her parents to never let the story die. Today, the Sodder children's disappearance remains one of the most enduring cold cases in American history. It's a story of a devastating fire, a botched investigation, and a trail of bizarre clues that lead everywhere and nowhere at once. It's a testament to a family's unbreakable love and their refusal to accept an official story that never added up. Nearly 80 years have passed. The house is long gone, replaced by a garden of memory. The parents and all 10 of their children have now passed away, but the questions still burn. Were 5 children tragically lost in an accidental fire, their remains mysteriously destroyed? Or was something far more sinister at play that Christmas Eve, a carefully planned arson to cover up the abduction of 5 children who may have lived out their lives under new identities, forever looking over their shoulders? The official case may be closed, but the debate is far from over. What do you think happened to the Sodder children? Was it a tragic accident, a mafia kidnapping, or something else entirely? Share your theories in the comments below. In the vast, empty expanse of the New Mexico desert, a secret was buried for years, a secret written in bone, scattered across a landscape that was supposed to become a new suburban neighbourhood. In 2009, a chance discovery would unearth a nightmare, revealing one of America's most disturbing and sprawling crime scenes. It's a story about a phantom killer, a burial ground holding the victims of his silent rampage, and a city forced to confront a string of disappearances it had largely ignored. On February 2nd, 2009, a woman named Christine Ross was walking her dog, Ruka, on a dusty patch of the West Mesa, a barren stretch of land on the western edge of Albuquerque. The area was being graded for a new housing development, the earth churned up and flattened. Ruka, running ahead, got fixated on something sticking out of the soil. It was a large bone. Unsure of what she was looking at, Ross snapped a photo and sent it to her sister, who was a nurse. Her sister confirmed her fear. It looked like a human femur. Christine Ross immediately called the police, and what started with a single bone quickly spiraled into a full-scale excavation. As investigators carefully combed the nearly 100-acre site, the grim reality began to surface. One grave led to another and then another. This wasn't a single homicide, it was a mass grave. Over the coming weeks and months, authorities would unearth the skeletal remains of 11 women and 1 unborn child. The discovery sent a shockwave through Albuquerque. This was the work of a serial killer, one who had operated for years, using the desolate mesa as his personal cemetery. The media dubbed him the West Mesa Bone Collector. This is the story of the massive but frustrating hunt for that phantom, the suspects who may have gotten away with it, and the victims whose voices were silenced twice, first by their killer and then by a society that had looked the other way. With a list of suspects but no convictions, one haunting question remains: who got away with murder, and why has justice been so elusive? To understand the scale of this tragedy, we have to go back to the years between 2003 and 2005, when these women vanished from the streets of Albuquerque. Their disappearances weren't headline news. For the most part, they didn't trigger massive search parties or widespread public outcry. The victims were overwhelmingly young, Hispanic women, and many were connected to the city's struggles with drug addiction and sex work. This common link made them vulnerable, not just to a predator, but to systemic indifference. When they went missing, their families' pleas for help were often dismissed. But these women were so much more than the circumstances they were in. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, and cousins. One of the first to be identified was 22-year-old Michelle Valdez. Her father, Dan, remembers a young woman whose smile could energize a room. When Michelle walked in, it lit up, he said, emphasizing that she was a beautiful, loved person. At the time of her murder, Michelle was 4 months pregnant, and the tiny bones of her unborn child were found buried with her. Her mother, Karen, later recalled hearing rumours that Michelle and her friend, another victim named Cinnamon Elks, had been killed and buried on the mesa long before their bodies were ever found. The 2 youngest victims were just 15 years old. Jamie Barella was last seen in April 2004 with her 27-year-old cousin Evelyn Salazar, who was also found in the mass grave. The two had left a family gathering to go to a park and were never seen again. Unlike most of the other victims, Jamie had no known connection to sex work or drugs, a detail that only deepens the mystery of how she crossed paths with the killer. The other 15-year-old was Celania Edwards, the only African-American victim and the only one from out of state. Originally from Lawton, Oklahoma, Celania was an endangered runaway who was last seen in 2003. She may have been using the nicknames Mimi or Chocolate and was seen in Colorado before she disappeared, her journey ending in that shallow grave hundreds of miles from home. Her case highlights the terrifying reach of the predator or predators involved. Doreen Marquez was 24 and a mother of 2. Her sister Julie recalled the painful last time she saw her. Doreen was struggling with addiction. After Julie found drug paraphernalia, she asked her to leave, a decision that would haunt her. Julie filed multiple missing persons reports, but she felt they were never taken seriously by police until the discovery on the mesa. Victoria Chavez, 26, was remembered by her mother as an outgoing and fun person who loved the outdoors. Her mother's grief was mixed with disbelief. The full list of victims is a heartbreaking roll call of stolen lives. Monica Candelaria, 22, Victoria Chavez, 26, Virginia Cloven, 24, Celania Edwards, 15, Cinnamon Elks, 32, Doreen Marquez, 24, Julie Nieto, 24, Veronica Romero, 28, Evelyn Salazar, 27, Michelle Valdez, 22, and her unborn child, and Jamie Barella, 15. As investigators pieced together their identities, a chilling pattern emerged. They had all disappeared roughly between 2003 and 2005, a window of terror that had gone largely unnoticed. The discovery confirmed what one detective, Ida Lopez, had suspected years earlier when she began compiling a list of missing women from similar backgrounds. The city had a serial killer, and his victims had finally been found. The burial site on the West Mesa was one of the largest and most complex crime scenes in Albuquerque's history. The Albuquerque Police Department, alongside the FBI, established a dedicated task force that at its peak involved over 40 people. But the investigation was a monumental undertaking filled with challenges from the very beginning. The first major hurdle was the condition of the remains. After years buried in the harsh desert, the bodies were completely skeletonized. This made figuring out the cause of death incredibly difficult. Investigators have said there was no obvious evidence of gunshots or blunt force trauma. The prevailing theory is that the women were strangled, but without soft tissue, finding definitive proof is nearly impossible. This lack of a clear cause of death would become a major roadblock for any future prosecution. Forensic teams worked painstakingly using dental records and DNA to identify the 11 victims, but finding the killer's DNA was another story. The exposed, sun-baked crime scene offered very little in terms of usable forensic evidence that could link a suspect to the site. Investigators were left with a mountain of circumstantial evidence and a puzzle with far too many missing pieces. One of the most significant clues came not from the ground, but from the sky. After the discovery, investigators analysed satellite imagery taken between 2003 and 2005. The images showed tyre tracks and patches of disturbed soil in the exact area where the remains were recovered. By 2006, however, the landscape began to change as development encroached. The site was graded and platted for new homes, burying the evidence even deeper. The window of opportunity to catch the killer in the act, or at least find fresh evidence, had long since closed. Detectives cast a wide net, looking into pimps, johns, and violent offenders. One of the few pieces of physical evidence found near the graves was a small plastic plant tag. This seemingly insignificant item was traced back to local nurseries. It was a tangible thread, something detectives hoped might lead somewhere. That thread, combined with other tips, pointed them toward people with landscaping backgrounds who would have a reason to be at nurseries and would be familiar with moving earth. One of those people was a man named Joseph Blee, but as the investigation grew, another name emerged. A man with a known history of extreme violence against sex workers who lived just a few miles from the burial ground and whose own violent death in 2006 coincided with the end of the disappearances. His name was Lorenzo Montoya. The task force now had two primary persons of interest, two very different men who both seemed to fit the profile of a monster. The question was, which one was the West Mesa bone collector, or could it have been both? With a crime this big, attention quickly focused on finding a viable suspect. Over the years, two names have consistently remained at the top of the list for investigators: Joseph Blee and Lorenzo Montoya. Both men had dark histories involving violence against women, and both had connections that put them squarely on the police radar. Let's look at Joseph Blair first. Blair was already a convicted serial rapist, known for a series of attacks in the 1980s. He was finally brought to justice for those crimes decades later through DNA evidence and is currently serving a long prison sentence. When the West Mesa bodies were discovered, Blee's own ex-wife called police and told them he should be a suspect. The circumstantial evidence against Blair seemed compelling. He had a landscaping business, and his ex-wives claimed he would often make trips to the West Mesa at night, supposedly to dump debris. This seemed to align with the plant nursery tag found near the burial site, as Blair was known to frequent local nurseries. A search of his home uncovered suspicious items, like women's jewellery that didn't belong to his wife or daughter. According to a cellmate, Blee allegedly referred to the West Mesa victims as trashy. Investigators also found his DNA on the clothing of a sex worker who was found dead on Central Avenue, though he has not been charged in her death. Despite these connections, investigators hit a wall. While they could trace the plant tag to certain nurseries, they couldn't definitively tie Blee to that specific purchase. And while his history was deeply disturbing, there was no direct forensic evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints to place him at the mass grave. Blee has always denied any involvement in the murders and has never been charged. The second primary suspect is Lorenzo Montoya. Montoya lived in a trailer park less than 3 miles from where the bodies were buried. Some reports even noted that dirt trails seemed to lead from his neighbourhood toward the burial site. Unlike Blair, Montoya's history was one of explosive, hands-on violence. He had been arrested multiple times for brutal attacks on sex workers. Co-workers told police he had openly talked about killing women and burying their bodies on the West Mesa. The timeline surrounding Montoya is maybe the most convincing argument for his involvement. The string of disappearances seemed to stop abruptly in 2006. So, what happened in 2006? Lorenzo Montoya died. In December of that year, Montoya hired a 19-year-old sex worker named Sharika Hill. Inside his trailer, he strangled her. As he was trying to put her body into the trunk of his car, he was confronted by her boyfriend, who shot and killed Montoya in self-defense. At the time, law enforcement said they didn't believe this was the first time Montoya had killed because the crime was too brutal. For investigators, this was a watershed moment. The murders stopped when Montoya died. He lived near the site, had a history of violence that matched the presumed cause of death, and had even bragged about doing exactly what the killer did. One former police chief has called Montoya probably our best suspect. However, with Montoya dead, the investigation faced a new problem. A search of his home turned up nothing to definitively tie him to the other 11 victims. The case also ran into legal and policy roadblocks regarding the use of a deceased, uncharged suspect's DNA in national databases, complicating efforts to link him forensically to other crimes. So we're left with 2 strong but uncharged suspects. One, a convicted serial rapist, alive but behind bars. The other, a violent killer who is dead, connected by a chilling timeline and his own dark words. Is one of them the West Mesa bone collector, or is the truth something even more complex? Some theories even suggest a sex trafficking ring, pointing to the fact that at least 8 other women with similar backgrounds remain missing from that era. More than 15 years have passed since Christine Ross and her dog stumbled upon that first human bone. Today, the West Mesa looks different. The once desolate patch of dirt is now the site of a memorial, a place dedicated to the 11 women and the unborn child who were found there. It is a place of quiet reflection, but it's also a stark reminder of a case that remains a gaping wound for Albuquerque and the victims' families. The West Mesa killer has never been identified, and the investigation, which started as a massive task force, has dwindled over the years, though it remains officially open. Detectives still field tips, and the hope remains that a new piece of information or a new forensic technique could finally break the case open. A reward of up to $100,000 still stands for information leading to an arrest and conviction. But the case is a chilling study in how justice can be derailed. The initial indifference to the victims' disappearances gave the killer years to operate. The condition of the remains has made forensic analysis a monumental challenge. The stories of the 2 main suspects, Joseph Blair and Lorenzo Montoya, leave us with unsettling possibilities. Is the killer already imprisoned for other crimes, his secret safe behind prison walls, or did he die in 2006, taking the full truth of his rampage to the grave? And what about the other women who vanished during that same period? Are they buried in another undiscovered location? These are the questions that haunt investigators and the families left behind. The West Mesa case is more than just an unsolved mystery. It's a tragedy that exposed how marginalised women are made vulnerable and how societal indifference can allow a predator to flourish in the shadows. The voices of Monica Candelaria, Victoria Chavez, Virginia Cloven, Selenia Edwards, Cinnamon Elks, Doreen Marquez, Julie Nieto, Veronica Romero, Evelyn Salazar, Michelle Valdez, and Jamie Barella were silenced once by their killer. Their stories must continue to be told, not just to honour their memory, but to remind us that the hunt for their killer is not over. Justice, however delayed, is still owed. The West Mesa murders remain an active investigation. If you have any information, no matter how small it might seem, you are urged to contact the Albuquerque Police Department or Albuquerque Metro Crime Stoppers at 505-843-STOP. The lack of closure in this case continues to be a source of immense pain for the victims' families. What are your theories on this case? Do you believe one of the primary suspects is the killer, or could there be another explanation? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. Thank you for joining us for this in-depth look into a truly haunting case. If you found this story informative and want to help keep cases like this from being forgotten, please like this video and subscribe for more unsolved mysteries. Your support helps us continue to shine a light on cases that demand justice. In 1922, on a remote German farmstead called Hinterkaifeck, 6 people were slaughtered with a mattock, a farmer's pickaxe. But the horror didn't stop there. Evidence strongly suggests that for days after the attack, the killer lived among the dead, tending to the livestock and eating meals in the house before simply vanishing. A century later, the case remains one of Germany's most infamous and haunting unsolved mysteries. It's a story defined not just by the sheer brutality of the crime, but by the chilling, almost supernatural events that led up to it and the baffling investigation that followed. This is a case with no witnesses, no confession, and no clear motive. It's a puzzle of strange clues, reports of footprints in the snow that led to the farm but never away, mysterious noises from the attic, and a set of house keys that vanished just before the attack. The story of Hinterkaifeck is a descent into a darkness that has puzzled investigators and amateur sleuths for over 100 years. It forces us to ask a terrifying question. What's scarier? A monster who breaks down your door, or one who might have already been living inside your walls? As we unpack this deeply disturbing case, I want to hear from you. What are your initial thoughts on a killer who stays at the scene of the crime? If you're fascinated by the world's darkest and most perplexing cold cases, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, because you won't want to miss the details we're about to uncover. Now, let's go back to 1922, to a lonely farmstead in the heart of rural Bavaria. Hinterkaifeck wasn't really a town, it was just the name for a single, isolated property about 70 kilometers north of Munich. The farm was home to the Gruber family, the patriarch, 63-year-old Andreas, his 72-year-old wife Kazilia, their 35-year-old widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, and her 2 children, 7-year-old Kazilia and 2-year-old Joseph. Also living in the home was the new maid, 44-year-old Maria Baumgartner. She had just arrived on the very day the murders would take place. The Grubers were known for being private, almost reclusive. Andreas, in particular, had a reputation for being ill-tempered and domineering. The family's isolation wasn't just physical, it was social. Dark rumours circulated in the nearby villages, whispers of an incestuous relationship between Andreas and his daughter Victoria, a secret that had already led to a conviction and only pushed the family further from the community. This isolation is key to understanding the terror that was about to unfold. In the weeks before the murders, the farm became the stage for a series of unnerving events. It started about 6 months earlier when the family's previous maid, Crescence Rieger, suddenly quit. She told people she left because she heard persistent, unsettling noises from the attic and felt an oppressive sense of being watched. Andreas dismissed her fears, but soon he'd have his own strange encounters. In March of 1922, just days before the massacre, Andreas confided in his neighbours. He told them he'd found a single set of footprints in the fresh snow, leading from the dense forest right up to the farmhouse. Chillingly, he couldn't find any tracks leading back. It was as if someone had walked out of the woods and simply vanished into the home. The strange occurrences didn't stop there. The family started hearing footsteps from the attic, the same sounds that had driven the last maid away. Andreas searched but found no one. Then, a newspaper from Munich that nobody had bought showed up on the property. Finally, one of the main house keys disappeared. All of these signs pointed to a terrifying theory that an unknown person wasn't just lurking around the farm, but was perhaps hiding there in the shadows, observing the family's every move. The sounds in the attic, the missing key, it all suggested an intruder had already breached their defences. Yet, Andreas was a stubborn man and refused offers of help from his neighbours, choosing to handle the unseen threat himself. It was a decision that would prove fatal for his entire family. The stage was set, the farm was cut off, the family was on edge, and an unknown presence was hiding just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came on the final day of March. The evening of Friday, March 31st, 1922, was cold and dark. It was the day the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived to start her new life at Hinterkaifeck. It would also be her last. The exact sequence of events that night can only be estimated from the grim scene the killer left behind, but investigators have pieced together a plausible and horrifying scenario. It's believed the massacre began in the barn. The killer, showing a familiarity with farm life, likely created a disturbance with the animals to lure the family out of the house one by one. The first to go was almost certainly Andreas Gruber. As the man of the house, he would have been the first to investigate. There, in the dark, the killer lay in wait. The weapon was a mattock, a heavy farming tool wielded with brutal force. Andreas was struck down. When he didn't return, his wife, Cecilia, likely went looking for him. She met the same fate. Then came their daughter, Victoria, and finally, her 7-year-old child, also named Cecilia. They were all lured into the barn and murdered in the same gruesome manner, with devastating blows to the head. The autopsy would later paint a horrific picture of their final moments, but the most heartbreaking detail related to young Cecilia. The evidence suggested she hadn't died instantly. She seems to have remained alive for several hours after the attack, lying in the hay next to the bodies of her mother and grandparents. In her terror, she had torn out clumps of her own hair. It's a detail so profoundly awful, it's hard to even comprehend. A child's last moments spent in unimaginable fear and pain. With 4 family members dead in the barn, the killer then moved to the main house. Inside, 2 people remained: the new maid, Maria, and Victoria's 2-year-old son, Joseph. The killer entered the home, likely with the key that had gone missing, and finished their ghastly work. Maria was killed in her bedchamber. Little Joseph was murdered in his cot with a single, powerful blow. 6 people were now dead. The isolated farm of Hinterkaifeck had fallen silent. For any normal killer, this would have been the time to run. But the Hinterkaifeck killer was far from normal. The killing was just the beginning. What they did next elevates this case from a brutal murder to a truly legendary tale of psychological horror. After committing 6 murders, the killer didn't run, they stayed. For the next few days, it's believed the murderer lived at Hinterkaifeck, surrounded by the bodies of their victims. This is the single most baffling aspect of the case. Neighbours later reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney over the weekend. An investigation of the kitchen showed that someone had been eating meals. Most unnervingly, the farm animals had been cared for. The cattle were fed and the family dog was found unharmed. This suggests a person with an almost unimaginable level of cold-blooded composure. This wasn't a panicked amateur. This was someone methodical, calm, and disturbingly comfortable in the home they had just turned into a tomb. It pointed to someone who knew their way around a farm, even with the evidence of their horrific crime lying just feet away in the barn. For 4 long days, the farm remained quiet. The family's absence wasn't noticed right away. 7-year-old Cecilia missed school on Saturday, April 1st, and again on Monday, April 3rd. The family, known for being reclusive, didn't show up for church on Sunday. The postman noticed the mail piling up. Slowly, concern began to build. On April 4th, a repairman was scheduled to visit the farm. When no one answered his calls, he looked around but saw nothing amiss and left. Later that day, a search party was finally organised, led by a neighbour named Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Schlittenbauer and 2 other men entered the barn first. What they discovered would haunt them for the rest of their lives. There, partially covered by hair and an old door, they found the bodies of Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria and young Cecilia stacked together. Reeling from the horror, Schlittenbauer then went to the main house. In a move that would later be seen as highly suspicious, he apparently unlocked the front door with ease and went in alone. Inside, he found the remaining two victims, the maid, Maria, in her bedroom, and little Joseph, dead in his cot. The farm of the dead had finally given up its secret. The discovery of the bodies kicked off a chaotic and ultimately fruitless investigation. The moment the search party entered, the crime scene was compromised. Neighbours and onlookers swarmed the farm, moving bodies, touching objects, and generally contaminating any potential evidence before the police could arrive from Munich. The autopsies were conducted right there in the barn. The murder weapon, the mattock, wasn't found at the scene. It was only discovered a year later, hidden in the attic when the farm was demolished in 1923. Robbery was largely dismissed as a motive, as a large sum of money was found untouched inside the house. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. The evidence suggested it was personal. Over 100 suspects were interviewed in the years that followed, but no one was ever charged. The investigation became a catalogue of dead ends. In one of the most bizarre footnotes to the case, the heads of the 6 victims were removed before burial and sent to Munich for further examination. These skulls were subsequently lost during World War II, forever preventing any modern forensic analysis, like DNA testing, that might have one day identified the killer. The police were left with theories, rumours, and a community full of suspicion. They were hunting a ghost, a killer who had planned their attack with chilling precision, lived among their victims with unnatural calm, and then vanished. In 2007, students at a German police academy took on Hinterkaifeck as a cold case project. Using modern investigative techniques, they analysed the old files and reportedly came to an agreement on a prime suspect. However, out of respect for the suspect's living relatives, they have never publicly revealed the name. The case remains officially unsolved. So, who would do something like this? The investigation produced several compelling suspects. The first, and maybe the most prominent, was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbour who led the search party. Schlittenbauer had a complicated history with the Grubers. He'd been in a relationship with Victoria and claimed to be the father of her 2-year-old son, Josef. Their plans to marry had been blocked by Victoria's controlling father, Andreas. Schlittenbauer's behaviour on the day of the discovery was highly suspicious. He seemed to know his way around the locked farm too well, and those with him said he handled the bodies with a disturbing lack of shock. An anecdote that circulated years later claimed he was found at the demolished farm's ruins and made a strange comment about the ground having been frozen at the time of the murders, which some took as knowledge only the killer could have. Did a dispute over paternity and his thwarted love for Victoria drive him to kill the entire family? The second major theory involves a ghost from the past, Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband. Gabriel was reported killed in action during World War I, but his body was never recovered. This led to speculation that he might have survived. According to this theory, Gabriel returned to Germany years later, maybe after hearing his wife had a child with another man. In a jealous rage, he could have sought revenge. There were even unconfirmed reports from German prisoners of war returning from Soviet Russia who claimed a German-speaking officer confessed to being the Hinterkaifeck murderer, but there's no real evidence that Carl Gabriel ever made it back to Germany alive. Beyond these two, police looked at others. The Bichler brothers had worked on the farm, and one of them, Anton, had apparently told the former maid that the Grubers ought to be dead. Other theories pointed to wandering vagrants or disgruntled farmhands. One particularly dark and very fringe theory even suggested that Andreas Gruber himself was the killer, and that after slaughtering his family, he was killed by an unknown accomplice. Each theory presents a plausible story, but none are supported by hard proof, and so we're left with the same questions that have echoed for a century. Why were the murders committed with such brutal, personal violence? Why was a large sum of money left behind? And most hauntingly, why did the killer stay? What kind of person can live for days alongside their victims, tending to the animals and stoking the fire before melting back into the world without a trace? The story of Hinterkaifeck is more than just an unsolved crime. It's a chilling reminder of the darkness that can exist in the most isolated corners of the world, and of the terrifying possibility that sometimes the monster isn't an outsider, but someone who knows you all too well. The truth of what happened on that farm in 1922 likely died with the killer, leaving behind only a perfect and perfectly terrifying mystery. The Hinterkaifeck case is a labyrinth of theories, and those police academy students who last reviewed it seem to believe they know the answer, even if they can't say it. Who do you think was responsible? Was it the jilted neighbour, the ghost husband, or someone else entirely? If you found this journey into one of history's darkest cold cases as fascinating as I do, please give this video a like and subscribe for more dives into the unknown. Thank you for watching. On a frigid February night, a promising nursing student named Maura Murray crashes her car on a remote New Hampshire road. A neighbour offers to help. She refuses, saying she's already called for assistance. But when police arrive just minutes later, the car is locked and Maura Murray is gone. There were no footprints in the deep snow, no signs of a struggle, and no credible sightings of her ever again. For over 2 decades, this case has obsessed the internet. But the real key to this mystery might not be in the conflicting theories, but in the secrets Maura left behind in the days leading up to her disappearance. This is what you might not know about the disappearance of Maura Murray. Before the empty car on a snowy road, there was Maura Murray, a daughter, a sister, a gifted athlete, and a brilliant student with a clear path forward. To understand how a person can simply vanish, we first have to understand who she was. Born and raised in Hanson, Massachusetts, Maura was a star runner and a high achiever who earned an appointment to the prestigious United States Military Academy at West Point. Though she excelled, she eventually transferred to the University of Massachusetts Amherst to pursue her dream of becoming a nurse. By all accounts, she was dedicated and driven, on track to graduate and start a life of helping others. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect life, cracks were starting to show. Maura was navigating the pressures of a demanding nursing program, a long-distance relationship, and the weight of her own high expectations. Her family described her as trusting, someone who always looked for the good in people. This portrait of a determined yet vulnerable young woman is so important because the events that unfolded in the days before she disappeared suggest a person in quiet turmoil, grappling with secrets she shared with no one. The mystery of Maura Murray doesn't begin with her disappearance. It begins with the troubling and inexplicable days that led her to that dark road in the first place. It's in these hidden moments that we find the first clues to what you don't know about her story. To understand what happened on that cold night, we have to look at the 48 hours leading up to the crash. This is where the story shifts from a simple missing person case into a complex psychological puzzle. The strange behaviour really kicks off on Thursday, February 5th, 2004, just 4 days before she vanished. While working her campus security job at UMass Amherst, Maura took a phone call that left her completely distraught. A supervisor found her in a catatonic-like state, glassy-eyed and unresponsive, just repeating the words, "My sister." The call was from her older sister, Kathleen, who was dealing with some personal issues. While Kathleen later said nothing catastrophic had happened, Maura was so shaken her supervisor had to walk her back to her dorm room. This wasn't just a bad day, it was a profound breakdown, a glimpse into a mind under immense pressure. In the days that followed, Maura's actions became less about distress and more about deliberate, silent preparation. She started methodically packing the contents of her dorm room into boxes. When police would later search it, they found most of her belongings packed away, the art taken down from the walls. On top of one of the boxes was a printed out email to her boyfriend, suggesting there was trouble in their relationship. She turned to her computer, searching for directions to the Berkshires and Burlington, Vermont, and looked into lodging, though she never booked a room. Then, on the morning of Monday, February 9th, with classes cancelled due to a snowstorm, she made her move. She sent emails to her professors and work supervisor telling them she'd be gone for a week because of a death in the family. It was a complete lie. Her family confirmed there was no death, no funeral, no emergency. It was a story designed to buy her time. With her excuse in place, she drove off campus. She stopped at an ATM and withdrew $280, nearly all the money in her account. From there, she went to a liquor store and purchased about $40 worth of alcohol, Kahlua, vodka, and a box of wine. Security cameras from both locations confirmed she was alone. She also had accident report forms from a crash she'd been in with her father's car just 2 days earlier. At 4:37 p.m, she checked her voicemail for the last time. After that, her phone was never used again. Packing her car with textbooks, toiletries, clothes, and the alcohol she had just bought, Maura Murray drove north toward the White Mountains of New Hampshire into the fading light of a winter afternoon. She had told no one where she was going, and she was heading toward a fate that remains one of America's most enduring mysteries. At approximately 7:27 p.m, on a sharp, unlit hairpin turn on Route 112 in Haverhill, New Hampshire, Maura Murray's black satin sedan slid off the road and into a snowbank. It wasn't a catastrophic wreck, but the car was disabled and its airbags deployed. A local school bus driver, Butch Atwood, was heading home when he came upon the scene. He pulled over and asked the young woman behind the wheel if she needed help, if he should call the police. Maura, who seemed cold but uninjured, reportedly refused his offer. She claimed she had already called AAA for roadside assistance, a claim that was almost certainly untrue since there was no cell service in that remote area. She pleaded with him not to call the police. Unsettled, but respecting her wishes, Atwood drove home, just a short distance down the road. Once there, he decided to call 911 anyway, reporting the accident at 7:43 p.m. At 7:46 p.m, a Haverhill police officer arrived at the crash site. In the few minutes that had passed since Butch Atwood spoke to her, Maura Murray had vanished. The car was locked. Inside, her things seemed to be waiting for her. The box of wine was on the passenger seat, and a Coke bottle appeared to hold a mixed drink. Her backpack, her college textbooks, and her favourite stuffed animal were all there. But several key items were gone: her wallet, her ID, her credit cards, and her cell phone. None have ever been found. There were no footprints leading into the deep snow surrounding the road. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing to indicate violence or a frantic escape into the woods. It was as if she had been there one moment and had simply been plucked from the earth the next. The officer was faced with a chilling scene: an abandoned car, a collection of personal items, and a missing driver who had disappeared into the freezing night air without a trace. In the critical first hours and days, the official response was shaped by a crucial assumption. Police initially treated Maura's case as someone who had voluntarily walked away. Believing she was a troubled young woman who wanted to disappear, they didn't issue a "be on the lookout" report until the following afternoon, nearly 18 hours after she was last seen. As her frantic family arrived in New Hampshire, the search finally began to escalate. Search teams and tracking dogs were brought in. It was here that one of the most perplexing clues of the entire case emerged. The dogs picked up Maura's scent at the crash site and followed it for about 100 yards east down Route 112, where the trail just stopped in the middle of the road. This suggested she didn't wander into the woods, but likely got into another vehicle, either willingly or by force. This detail completely changed the complexion of the case. The search expanded into one of the largest in New Hampshire history. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras scanned the vast, dense forests. Ground teams and cadaver dogs scoured the landscape for miles. Despite these exhaustive efforts, they found nothing. No scrap of clothing, no backpack, no sign that Maura had ever set foot off that road. The woods, it seemed, were keeping their secrets. 10 days after her disappearance, the FBI joined the investigation. Hopeful leads turned into dead ends. Her bank accounts were never touched. Her credit cards were never used. As days turned into weeks, the terrifying possibility of foul play or a fatal accident in the wilderness became the two dominant and equally frightening scenarios. For over 20 years, three main theories have been debated by investigators, her family, and an army of online sleuths. Each is compelling and each is deeply flawed. First, there's the theory that Maura succeeded. She voluntarily disappeared to start a new life. The evidence for this is hard to ignore. She packed her things, including her college textbooks. She withdrew a significant amount of cash. She lied to her professors to create a week-long window where she wouldn't be missed. The internet searches for directions to Vermont and lodging options further support the idea she was planning an escape. Some have even speculated she might have been dealing with a secret pregnancy, pointing to her internet search history about the effects of alcohol on a fetus. Perhaps she felt trapped and saw running away as her only option. But this theory unravels quickly. If her goal was a clean getaway, why crash her car on a remote road? And more importantly, how has a smart, resourceful woman stayed completely off the grid for 2 decades, never once accessing her bank accounts, using her social security number, or contacting anyone from her old life? Vanishing so completely is almost as mysterious as the disappearance itself. The second theory is foul play. This theory hangs on that scent trail ending abruptly in the road. It suggests she accepted a ride from someone, either a passing predator or someone she had arranged to meet. The isolation of Route 112, the darkness, and her vulnerable state would have made her an easy target. Her sister Julie believes this is the most likely scenario, that she got into a car with the wrong person. The missing phone and wallet could have been taken by an abductor to prevent her from being tracked. However, like the first theory, this one suffers from a complete lack of physical proof. There were no signs of a struggle at the crash site. No credible witnesses reported seeing another car stop. No evidence has ever surfaced to point to a specific person. Despite decades of investigation, it remains a theory built on absence. Finally, there is the simplest and perhaps most tragic explanation. She was lost to the elements, disoriented and possibly intoxicated after the crash. Panicked about police getting involved, Maura could have run into the dense woods to hide, only to get lost and succumb to the brutal, freezing temperatures. This would explain her refusal of help and her quick departure from the scene. But this theory is haunted by one giant question. Where is she? The area was searched extensively by teams with thermal imagers and cadaver dogs, which are trained to find remains even years later. Yet not a single shred of evidence, no clothing, no bones, nothing has ever been found. If Maura Murray was lost to the elements, the wilderness has guarded her secret with impossible perfection. Maura's case was one of the first to explode in the age of the internet. From the earliest days, online forums were filled with amateur detectives dissecting every clue. This digital obsession brought huge attention to her disappearance, but also created a storm of misinformation and conspiracy theories that has been deeply painful for her family. Podcasts have kept her story in the public eye, re-examining evidence and interviewing key figures. And through this relentless public focus, small but tantalizing clues have emerged. A few months after she vanished, a contractor came forward. On the night of the disappearance, between 8 and 8:30 p.m, he saw a young person walking quickly along Route 112, about 4 to 5 miles east of the crash site. He didn't report it at the time, only realizing its significance later when reviewing work records. Was this Maura? If so, where was she going? More recently, a significant development brought a new name into the investigation. In 2024, it was revealed that a fingerprint found inside Maura's car matched a man named Stephen Baldwin, a fellow cadet from her time at West Point. Baldwin, currently in prison for unrelated felonies, had a past relationship with Maura at the academy. When questioned by the FBI, he claimed the fingerprint could have been from swapping CDs years earlier and denied any involvement in her disappearance. It's a forensic link that places him inside her car at some point, a new thread in a case full of them. After more than 20 years, Maura Murray's disappearance is officially considered suspicious. Her family has never stopped searching for answers, enduring the nightmare of not knowing. The story that began with a troubled young woman and a car crash in the snow has become a labyrinth of secrets, false leads, and enduring questions. Did she run away? Was she taken? Or did she simply wander into the woods and vanish from the world? The truth is, someone out there might know something. Someone saw a car that night, or a young woman walking on the road, or heard something that seemed insignificant at the time. The smallest detail could be the key. If you have any information about the disappearance of Maura Murray, please contact the New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit. What do you think happened on that lonely stretch of Route 112? Share your respectful theories in the comments. For Maura's family, the search for answers isn't about sensationalism, it's about bringing their daughter home. And until that day comes, her story will remain one of the most haunting and unsolved mysteries of our time. Enjoyed the video? Support the channel on Patreon. If you want early releases, behind the scenes content and bonus deep dives, click the link in the description and join our community over on Patreon. Your support helps me keep creating the videos you love. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.